Okay, it's Bob Gomez, and we're continuing our study in the Gospel of John. We're in chapter 18, and we'll start reading at verse 33. Pilate therefore entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? But your own nation and the chief priests delivered you up to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, that I might not be delivered up to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Pilate therefore said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews?" Therefore they cried out again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Okay, we'll stop at this point. Okay, as you recall, Jesus, after being tried in a court session before the Jewish authorities, where they found him guilty of claiming to be the Son of God, and since they did not believe that he was telling the truth, they accused him of blasphemy, and blasphemy had the penalty of death. Of course, he was telling the truth because he was the Son of God, but the Jews didn't believe him. But under the Roman law, they usually left the law of the countries that they conquered, they left it in place and did not interfere, except that they did not let the country they had conquered to put people to death. So if under the Jewish law they found somebody guilty of death, then they had to go to the Roman authority in order to have that person put to death. And so, remember when Jesus was first betrayed, they took him to Annas, and that was about midnight. From about midnight to about 3 o'clock, they were with Annas, and he was the previous high priest, but he still used the title of high priest. So Annas questioned Jesus, trying to get Jesus to say something that would incriminate himself, but he was unable to. And during that time, the messengers had gone out to bring in all the Sanhedrin, the members of Sanhedrin, which were 71, so that they could conduct a trial. And so about 3 o'clock in the morning, then they took Jesus from Annas to Caiaphas, to the assembly place of the Sanhedrin, where they conducted another trial. And this was the official Jewish trial. And here they were asking Jesus all kinds of questions. We don't have this in John, but we get it from the other Gospels. And trying to get Jesus to incriminate himself. And they also brought up false witnesses, which didn't agree with each other, until finally they asked Jesus if he was the Son of God, or Son of the Blessed, as they put it. And Jesus said yes, and that they would see him coming in power and great glory. Well, when Jesus said this, then they said, "What further need do we have of witnesses?" And so they accused him of blasphemy and sentenced him to death. But since they couldn't put Jesus to death, they had to take Jesus to the Roman authorities, which was Pilate. So this was about 6 o'clock in the morning now, and this was the normal time for the Roman court to start their session. So they had brought Jesus to Pilate, and he asked them what accusation they had against him, but they didn't. The Jews didn't tell the truth. All they said was, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. In other words, they just wanted Pilate to rubber stamp their decision and to approve their sentence of death. But Pilate was not going to do that. He wanted to find out whether Jesus was guilty of anything that was deserving of death, because the Romans had a very good legal system at that time, and that was one of the good things about the Roman Empire. So then Jesus is taken by Pilate, and Pilate questions him, and he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" In verse 34, Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Now the Jews had said that Jesus was claiming to be a king, but Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And there's a big difference between just being a king and being the king of the Jews. If you're just a king, that would be a threat to Tiberius, who was the Roman emperor at that time. And that would be in the secular sense. If Jesus was saying that he was a secular king and that he was going to revolt against the Romans and so forth, that would mean one thing. But if when he was said, "Are you the king of the Jews?" that would be like saying, "Are you the Messiah, the one who had been promised from the Old Testament?" So depending on what Pilate meant by his question would have an influence on the way Jesus answered the question. If Pilate meant, "Are you just a secular king and you're trying to revolt against the Roman government?" the answer would be no. But if Pilate meant, "Are you the Messiah, the king of Israel who had been promised in the Old Testament?" then the answer would be yes. So Jesus wants to make sure, for the record, what exactly Pilate meant. Of course, Jesus himself knew, but he wanted, for the record, to make that plain. So in verse 35, then, Pilate says, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest delivered you up to me." So in other words, his question was not something that he himself was personally asking, whether he was the Messiah, because the Jewish accusation had nothing to do with that. They were accusing him of being a secular king. So now Jesus makes Pilate say that his question is based on the accusation which the Jewish authorities had brought. And the Jewish authorities had not accused him of being the Messiah, but accused him of being a secular king, which of course was a false accusation. So then Jesus answered in verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world," meaning that he is not a king in the secular sense, that he is not revolting against Rome, but that his king is centered in heaven. And actually the word kingdom is a poor translation. A better translation would be "my kingship." In other words, the basis of my authority as king, or the basis of me claiming to be a king, is not located in this world, as all the other kings of the world would be. See, even Tiberius, the emperor of the Roman Empire, his basis of authority would be in the world. Even though God's providence had put him in that position, he did not have authority in any other part of the universe except right here on the world that God had given to him. But Jesus is saying that his kingdom is not centered or based in this world, implying that he is God and his authority and his kingship is universal. And as proof that he was not a threat are not intended to be a threat to Caesar. He said, if my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting. Well, the evidence was clear that Jesus did not have an army, did not have fighting servants, did not have a following who was trying to achieve political goals or anything like that. In other words, my servants would be fighting that I might not be delivered up to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. So Pilate understands that Jesus is not claiming to be a secular king, that he is not trying to overthrow the Roman government or anything like that. Now, Jesus is the king, and so he could not answer, either yes or no definitely, because that would be only half the truth. So, yes, he was a king because he was a Messiah, but no, he was not a king in the secular sense of the word. And so he clarified that. So Pilate understands that, but he is kind of curious now about the fact that Jesus is claiming to be a king, even though it's not of this world. So he asked in verse 37, Pilate therefore said to him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Okay, so the truth is he is a king. And he says, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Well, it's talking about the elect here, those who are predestined by God. And like Jesus said in another place, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them and they follow me. So those who are of the truth hear Jesus and believe in him. Pilate said to him, what is truth? Now, during this time and a few centuries preceding this, the world was around there in the Mediterranean was full of all kind of philosophers who were going around preaching different philosophies. You probably heard of all the Greek philosophies, Aristotle and Plato and all these other ones. Well, they all had their own brand of truth, and taking that into consideration, the idolatrous religions which were there in Rome, and all worshiping all these many gods and everything, and they were all claiming to be the truth. And at this time, the educated people had become very skeptical about all this, because everybody was claiming to be telling the truth, yet they were contradicting one another, and there wasn't any real fear or worship of their gods anymore, but there was more like superstition, and there was all of these myths about the different gods and things like that. So they were very superstitious, but they didn't really allow these philosophies and these religions to come into their life very often. It's more like being superstitious in that sense. And so when Paul says, when Pilate says, what is truth, he has all these conflicting philosophies and all these conflicting religions in mind. And so here he just acts as if Jesus was just another one of these religious teachers, another one of these philosophers who was just claiming to tell the truth, but, he didn't think that Jesus was any more true than any of the other philosophers or religious teachers around. So he was just being skeptical, Well, okay, you claim to be the truth. What is truth? How can I know what truth is? And then in the middle of verse 38, then it says, and when he had said this, as Pilate, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. So once again, Pilate tells the Jews that the accusations which they are bringing to him just don't stand up. And he finds no reason to put him to death or to punish him or anything else. So at this point, Pilate should have released Jesus and let him go. Said, okay, you're innocent of these charges. You're a free man. Go your way. And then he would have told the rest of the Jews, leave him alone. Don't bother him anymore. He's been tried. He's been found innocent. And so he's a free man. But Pilate is a very complicated person because he had done many wicked things in his life, and a lot of them were against the Jews and the people around there. And he has seen now how the Jews can lie, how they can bring a false accusation against a man and just stand there and lie, and doesn't even faze them. And so he is going to be fearful of his own position. And we're going to see how now he's starting to realize that if the Jews would start a rumor that he was being disloyal to the emperor, or if they brought false charges against the emperor, they could send a delegation to Rome and present all these false charges and lie, and they were so good at lying that they wouldn't be able to, Tiberius would not be able to tell that they were lying, and that would bring Pilate under suspicion of being disloyal, and Tiberius was known for severely punishing and putting to death people in his administration that he found to be disloyal, or who he suspected of being disloyal. And so, even though Pilate, in the legal sense, finds no guilt in Jesus, he still is reluctant to displease the Jews, especially these high priests. And so he begins committing a series of legal mistakes to protect himself. And so instead of releasing Jesus, he outright, because he's innocent, he thinks that he can release him by going by this custom that they have. Verse 39 says, "But you have a custom that I should release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews?" Well, the only ones that they released were convicted criminals. Now, Jesus was not a convicted criminal, so Pilate should not have offered to release him, because he should have just been set free, straight out, But by offering to release him, he's treating Jesus as if he already was a convicted criminal. So here, Pilate wants to release Jesus, but he doesn't want to make the Jews mad, because he's afraid of what they might do to him, and he would lose his position and might fall out of favor with Tiberius. So he suggests that they release Jesus. And in the other Gospels, we're told that he, according to custom, they usually presented two names of criminals, and then the people would have a choice of which one they were to release. So we're not told here that the Pilate offered Barabbas, but we know from other Gospels he did. So Jesus he had found innocent, and Barabbas was a very notorious criminal. He had actually revolted, tried to start a revolution, and had a lot of people had died in his revolting, in his rioting and everything. So he was a known criminal. And so it was unusual also when the two names were presented that the governor would suggest one over the other. He would let the Jews make a choice. But here, he presented Jesus and Barabbas to them as candidates to be released, and he suggests to them that they release Jesus. but the Jewish authorities aren't going to do that. They want Jesus to be crucified. Remember, the reason the Jews turned against Jesus was because Jesus had opposed them and pointed out how they were corrupt and they were not obeying the law. They had distorted the law, and they had rejected him as the Messiah. And the Jews were more interested in their own position and power than they were recognizing their own Messiah. And so it was out of envy that they brought Jesus. And so they were determined to go to any length to have Jesus put to death. And so verse 40, therefore they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. He was a robber. This is kind of an understatement. We find out from the other Gospels that he had committed murder, and he was also a revolutionary. Okay, so Pilate has a number of things going on. First of all, out of justice, he wants to release Jesus, but out of fear of the Jews and what they might do to him by bringing a false accusation against him, he is afraid that he might lose his power. So he's putting himself then ahead of justice. And so he didn't release Jesus the way he should have because he's trying to protect himself. Okay, let's continue reading then from verse 19. Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. And they began to come up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews, and to give him blows in the face. And Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Jesus therefore came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Behold the man. When therefore the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify, crucify. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. When Pilate therefore heard this statement, he was the more afraid. And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and have authority to crucify you? Jesus answered, You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me up to you has the greater sin. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, Behold your king. They therefore cried out, Away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to him, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Okay, so going back to verse 1 then, Pilate scourges Jesus. Now, maybe Pilate had hoped that by scourging Jesus, that would satisfy the Jews and they would stop insisting on crucifying Jesus. It's hard to understand why Pilate would scourge Jesus since he found him to be innocent of all charges. But he takes and scourges an innocent man. And so now things are really getting out of Pilate's control now. He is more interested in protecting himself than he is in justice. So he turns Jesus to the soldier. After he scourges Jesus, he somehow tells the soldiers to do a mock reception for Jesus. And so the soldiers weave a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and they take a purple robe and put it upon him, and then they began to mock him. They began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and to give him blows in the face. Now, once again, we can only speculate as to why Pilate had them do this. Maybe once again, he is hoping that the high priest and the other Jews who brought Jesus to him would accept this punishment in place of crucifying him. But we also know that Pilate had great dislike for the Jews. He despised them. And since Jesus was a Jew, he despised Jesus just as well. And he didn't really make any difference between Jesus and the other Jews. He despised them all. And so this is also another thing that's working against Pilate and taking away his judgment, because he's using every opportunity he can to insult the Jews. And Pilate, verse 4, came out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." So, what's really going on in Pilate's mind is probably he's starting to panic now, because in a way he doesn't want to crucify Jesus because he's innocent, but yet he's trying to protect himself because he's afraid of what the Jews might do to him. Jesus therefore came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When therefore the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." So Pilate is acting completely as a coward now. He's giving in to the Jews. He had all the Roman soldiers there. He could have said, "I find no fault in him. I'm going to release him." And then he would have ordered the soldiers to clear the area, and he could have had his way, but he didn't. So he's acting really cowardly now because of his fear. So he just kind of gives in to them, tells them to take and crucify Christ, even though he found no guilt in him. Then the Jews answered and said, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." So the Jews are themselves kind of panicking, because they're afraid that Pilate might release him. And so now they say that according to their law, and this is the first time they bring it up, and this is actually what they had found Jesus guilty of making himself out to be the Son of God. And this, of course, would be blasphemy. So now they let it out that Jesus had been sentenced to death because of blasphemy, something that Pilate would not even have concerned himself about had he known that from the very beginning. But now he's into it pretty deep, and he can't get out of it. And so this just adds to Pilate's fear and his confusion. Verse 8. When Pilate therefore heard this statement, he was the more afraid. Well, this would be superstitious fear, because in the Roman gods and religions, there were many accounts of how the gods had come into the world in the form of men and have lived among men and so forth. And so Pilate, even though he may not have believed it, he might have been superstitious, and he was afraid that if Jesus really was some God, that if he didn't do right by him, that the God might punish him. Of course, he had no concept of the true God. When he talked about gods, he thought about like Mars and Apollos and these pagan gods. So he was okay. So Pilate's fear then was superstition, and he was afraid that if Jesus really was some god that had come in to be a human and live among men, that if he didn't treat him right, that the God might take revenge on him. So he took Jesus back inside to the praetorium, verse 9, and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Well, Jesus had already told him that his kingdom was not of this earth, or his kingship was not of this world. And so now Pilate wants to know, well, where is his kingship from, or where is he from? But Jesus does not answer this question. And the reason for that is because, in essence, Jesus had already told him that his kingdom was not of this world, and that everyone who is of the truth hears his voice. And so Jesus is more or less telling him, look, I've already answered that question, and my answer still stands. Refer back to what I said before. See, Pilate is kind of like asking the same questions, except in a different form. So Jesus didn't answer him, and so Pilate kind of takes this as an insult, because Pilate is, in addition to everything else, is very proud that he is a Roman, and he despises the Jews. There's really a lot of prejudice and hatred here. And so he has all these mixtures of motivations going on within him. He's got fear, he's got pride, he's got a small amount of justice. He fears the gods. He fears his own position. He fears the emperor. And so he's really starting to panic himself. And so his pride kind of comes forward and says, "You do not speak to me. Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" So he starts telling Jesus, look, who I am. You don't seem to realize who I am. Well, notice right away that the situation immediately changes, where in Jesus' answers, he lets Pilate know in no uncertain terms that he is not really on trial. Jesus says, "I'm not really the one on trial. You're the one that's on trial." And what he said, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he," that is Caiaphas, "who delivered me up to you has the greater sin." So who's judging who now? Jesus is the judge, and he's telling Pilate, look, what you're doing is a great sin, and you're guilty. But there's one man that is more guilty than you, and that's Caiaphas. So you see, the situation has been completely reversed. Jesus is the judge, and he's saying to Pilate, you're committing a sin. Probably the three most three people in the world: Pilate, Judas, and Caiaphas. You know, the ones, the three most evil people in the world. But now Jesus is showing the truth here. He is the judge. He is going to be the final judge at the end of the world, at the last judgment. And so this comes as a warning, a final warning to Pilate, that what he is doing is a sin. It's probably the second greatest sin in the world. Caiaphas would be the greatest sinner. Pilate would be the second, and Judas would be the third. But, so he says, tells him point blank, the only reason you have authority over me is because of God's providence. God put you here because it's been foreordained from before the foundation of the world that I will die for the sin of the world, and that it would be done by Romans, and my death would be a Roman death, a death on the cross, and so forth. All this has all been predetermined down to the very last detail. He says, your authority is not real authority. It's just because you were in the position. It has been given you from above. And from above, that's where Christ's kingship comes from. So, in a sense, he answers Pilate's question when he says, where are you from? The answer is from above, from heaven. In verse 12, as a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. Now, this statement means that compared to what he is going to do now, all his previous efforts to release Jesus didn't amount to anything. Now, Pilate is really scared, and he wants more than anything to release Jesus. But he's way in over his head now. He's already made so many legal mistakes, and he's already gotten the high priest and the Jews into such a state that they are willing to accuse him of all kind of false things, that nothing now that Pilate can do is going to be successful in getting Jesus off. And this desire of Pilate to get Jesus released is going to take a back seat to Pilate protecting himself and his position. Okay, so it says, as a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. So the Jews understand Pilate. When he says, you are no friend of Caesar, that's putting it in the negative. What they're really meaning is, you are the enemy of Caesar. And they know just how to control Pilate. See, this is the accusation, this is the false accusation that they would bring against Pilate. If he released Jesus, these Jews would go straight to the emperor and stand before him and tell him that there was this man, Jesus, who was claiming to be a king, but Pilate let him go. See? And so they tell Pilate that this is a test. If you release Jesus, you are the enemy of Caesar. You're no friend of Caesar. And then they bring up another thing. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king, referring to Jesus, opposes Caesar. So that means, so Jesus, by claiming to be a king, is opposing Caesar. So if you release Jesus, that means that you are an accomplice with Jesus, and you also are opposing Caesar. So the Jews now had Pilate right where they wanted it. Pilate, if he wanted to protect himself, had no choice. If he was a man and stood up and was interested in justice, regardless of the situation, he would have released Jesus. But he wasn't. He was a coward. He feared his own destiny, his own um, punishment at the hands of Caesar. So he gave in. Verse 13. When Pilate therefore heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the pavement, on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Okay, so he's still trying to find a way out. Verse 14. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. Okay, the day of preparation is a technical term. It always refers to the day before the Sabbath. So this would be a Friday. The day of preparation refers mainly to all the cooking that had to be done to get ready for the next day, because the next day was Sabbath, the day of rest, and they were not allowed to do any cooking. And they had to do everything else they needed to do for the Sabbath so they would not have to work. There were a few things they were allowed to do, like feeding the animals and stuff like that. But for the most part, they were very restricted in what they could do on the Sabbath, and so they had to do it all ahead of time. So this is called the day of preparation, and that always means a Friday. So the argument about whether Jesus was crucified on a Thursday or a Friday is because of a misunderstanding of what this phrase means. It says the day of preparation for the Passover. Well, this is a poor translation. It means for the day of preparation, which was a special day of preparation during the Passover week. Now, the Passover had been the night before when Jesus and his disciples had eaten the Passover. That was the true Passover. But the Passover was celebrated for a whole week. There was a week of festivities after that, celebrating their exodus from Egypt and all that. But this means the day of preparation of the Passover week is what this really means, and this was a special day. So it does not mean that it was the day before the Passover. Actually, the Passover was on Thursday that week. His trial before Pilate was on Friday, which was the day of preparation for the Sabbath, which would be the next day. And so if you understand this, then you'd realize that this debate of when the crucifixion took place, whether it was Thursday or Friday, is settled because it took place on a Friday. Because the Friday is the day of preparation. And middle of verse 14, it was about the 6th hour. And he says to the Jews, "Behold your king." They therefore cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said, "Shall I crucify your king?" Chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Okay, now, in the other Gospels, it tells how Pilate washed his hands and said, "His blood be upon you. I am innocent of the blood of this just man." And the Jews answered, "Yes, his blood is upon us and upon our children." And so that's the way it's been ever since they rejected their Messiah. The Jews have seen nothing but suffering in the last 2,000 years. And this is the consequence of their rejecting their Messiah. And also, right along in here, remember Pilate's wife sends a message to him and says, "Have nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered much in a dream concerning him," and so forth. So there's all this. This, of course, what his wife's message, that plays into his superstitious fear. And so Pilate is just torn in all different directions, but the main thing he's concerned about is saving his own skin from false accusations which these Jews might bring against him to Tiberius. And so he says, "Shall I crucify your king?" And chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So once again, the Jews are saying, we're not even going to acknowledge a king, even if we do believe he's the true Messiah. What they're saying is, we are loyal to the emperor. And of course, this is partly a lie, because they are no more loyal to the emperor, but they are pretending to be loyal so that they can go, if necessary, and accuse Pilate of being disloyal. So the Jews are lying. They're just lying through their teeth, but they're so good at it, they could convince anybody. And so Pilate realizes that he is, that he is in a corner. There's no way for him to get out, so he gives in to them. So, verse 16, so he then delivered him, Jesus, to them to be crucified. Okay, so we see that the whole trial, everything was, contrary to the law. Everybody was lying. The Pilate was not really mainly interested in justice. The Jews, they wanted to get rid of Jesus at any cost. They were willing to lie and bring false accusations and false witnesses and everything against him. But we know that this was all according to the foreordination of God, and this was all predetermined by God. And if we turn over to the book of Acts, when Peter was preaching, he tells them in this verse about 13. Chapter 3, verse 13. Talking to the Jews there, it says, "The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified him," that is Jesus, "has glorified his servant Jesus, the one whom you delivered up and disowned in the presence of Pilate when he had decided to release him. But you disowned him, the holy and righteous one, and asked for a murderer to be granted to you, but put to death the Prince of Life, the one whom God raised from the dead, a fact to which we are witnesses. And on the basis of faith in his name, it is the name of Jesus which has strengthened this man whom you see and know." Okay, so here Peter had just healed this man, and they want to know, the people here want to know how he did it. And so Peter is telling them that it was through the power of Jesus that he had healed this man. And then back in chapter 2, verse 22, this is at the end of Peter's sermon there on the day of Pentecost, right after the Holy Spirit had come. It says to them, "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know, this man, delivered up by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God." See, all this was predetermined by God, the whole trial and everything. that went by, and Jesus was actually the one who predetermined that this would happen. By the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, it says, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men, that would be the Romans and including, and put him to death. Okay, so this shows us that what we have so far gone over this morning is seen from man's perspective. The trial and everything, how it was so illegal, and the hatred of the Jews, and the attempts by Pilate to release him, and Pilate's pride and its arrogance, and the way he despised the Jews, and the Jews, their fear that the Romans would come and take away their position and everything. This is all looking at it from the human perspective, but looking at it from God's perspective, then in verse Acts 2:23 says, this man delivered up by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to the cross. Okay, so this says that those Pilate and high priests, they were guilty of their actions. Remember, Jesus said, said to Pilate, he who delivered me to you has a greater sin. Yeah, they are still guilty and responsible for their sin, and yet it was all done according to the plan of God, because God had planned way before the foundation of the world that Jesus would die on the cross. And so, for us, this is a mystery, how the sovereignty of God and the so-called free will of man, they are in such agreement, and yet, even though it was predetermined and foreknown by God that it would happen, yet those men who were responsible for it will be held accountable for their sins. Okay, so we'll stop here for now and pick up again next week.